Hello, and welcome to our session on Be an ESSA Investigator, using evidence to guide decision-making. We look forward to sharing our journey with you and engaging you in a discussion and some exercises to practice your ESSA investigator skills. I am Dr. Amy Boza, the Director of ELA and Move On When Reading for the Arizona Department of Education.
And I'm Dr. Lene Dunn. I'm the Deputy Director for the Regional Educational Laboratory West, REL West, at WestEd. All right, let's get started. So REL West at WestEd is one of 10 labs across the country funded by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. We provide free services to states, districts, practitioners, and community partners to bridge the gap between research and practice to improve student outcomes. REL West, shown in red, we serve Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. We provide research to answer questions and solve problems relevant to practitioners. We share research and evidence to inform decision-making, and we provide technical support around the use of data and evidence. What we're sharing with you today is based on services and supports that we provided to ADE on ESSA evidence standards, a little bit of which Amy is going to share with you now.
Since we became ESSA investigators, we are excited to share some of that learning in an effort to help you and your team become ESSA investigators as well. Arizona's Move On When Reading legislation, ARS 15704, requires the use of evidence-based reading curriculum, along with some other critical factors. In efforts to best support our LEAs, we have been participating in significant coaching sessions from our colleagues in REL West for the past several months. Following a wealth of information, including authentic practice, we are eager to share this information with educators and school leaders through a series of videos ranging in topics, which you can find on our website. All of the recorded videos are, or will be soon, available on the Move On When Reading for Administrators webpage under the blue bar titled ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. The videos share the process of understanding the provisions and then applying them to curricular tools. We have put that link in the chat for you. Please follow the link and take a look. We'll pause for a moment while you do that. As you navigate to the site, you will notice the list of videos. Some are currently in production and will be available soon. However, most are ready to view. The videos are presented in a sequence that promotes understanding of the entire process and are most beneficial when viewed in order. Please also consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for notification of the release of the newest videos in our series. This is the team that has worked together to be ESSA investigators from ADE and WestEd. And we're certainly glad that you are here to join in our quest and be an ESSA investigator as well.
So take a moment to type in the chat, what do you think of when you hear the word evidence? Great, thank you. And we also are curious, what do you think of when you hear the phrase ESSA evidence levels? Great, well, we're going to talk a little bit more about those ESSA evidence levels. ESSA defines 4 tiers of evidence: strong, moderate, promising, and demonstrates a rationale. The tiers are defined by the study design. The more rigorous the design, the more confidence we have that the intervention or strategy is responsible for the outcomes. An experimental study is a randomized control trial where subjects, who are often students, are randomly assigned to a control group and a treatment group to compare their outcomes. This is defined as strong in the ESSA evidence tiers. In a quasi-experimental design, subjects are in a treatment or control group, but they're not randomly assigned to those groups. Instead, they're compared on a baseline measure, such as scores on a pretest, to ensure the groups are comparable before the intervention. This is defined as moderate in the ESSA evidence tiers. These top two tiers are considered impact designs as they associate outcomes with the intervention or strategy to estimate a causal relationship. Correlational studies do not measure impact. Instead, they measure the relationship between two variables, but we don't know the direction of the relationship between them because it's not a causal relationship. Correlational studies determine an association between the intervention and its desired outcomes, and in the definition of ESSA, need to include controls for selection bias. This is defined as promising in the ESSA evidence tiers. These top three tiers have to demonstrate statistically significant results on relevant outcomes. That could be student test scores, for example. The final tier demonstrates a rationale is a positive evaluation that shows that an intervention or strategy is likely to improve relevant outcomes. It needs to include a theory of action or logic model based on evidence and research and ongoing evaluation of the strategy. The goal is often for strategies that begin as a tier 4 intervention to move up to a higher tier as more rigorous evidence is developed on the strategy and its effects. To qualify for an evidence tiers, the study must be well designed and well implemented. We're going to discuss some aspects of what a well designed and well implemented study looks like in just a few minutes. This resource summarizes some of the key elements of the definitions of the evidence tiers based on the non-regulatory guidance developed by the U.S. Department of Education. It's a handy one-page reference to the evidence tiers that many have found useful in their work. We're putting the link to this document in the chat right now, so you can navigate there and take a look. So Amy, I know you've used this handout before. What have you found most useful about it?
This document is very helpful. My team and I have used it often. There are a couple of elements that keep us focused, specifically on the expectations of any research that we review. First is that improvement cycle right there on the front. Choosing an appropriate intervention should always be a part of a larger conversation about the needs of students and providing the best instruction possible. Focusing on that school improvement cycle and that review of materials and processes within a school is super helpful and very impactful in the larger scheme. Second, my team and I really appreciate the 5 factors on the bottom of the first page, along with that detailed information provided about each of those factors on the top of the next page. That information helps us in determining ESSA levels as we review research for products and tools.
We wanted to share some additional information with you just as we work through this about statistical significance and effect size and kind of how they differ. It's really important, and as you use that one page or other resources that we're sharing with you today, you'll notice that ESSA does not consider effect size in its definition of the evidence tiers. It only considers the study design and statistical significance of the outcomes. Statistical significance demonstrates that the difference between the treatment and control group outcomes are not caused by chance. The confidence that we have that the outcome is caused by the intervention or strategy depends on the design of the study, with randomized control trials giving the most confidence and being able to examine the impact of a strategy and those causal relationship to outcomes. Effect size is different. It's a measurement of the strength of the difference between the treatment and control group outcomes. It seeks to measure the meaning of the difference, and it's often shared in terms of weeks or months of learning to try and capture meaningful difference in outcomes. The strength of the effect is not included in the definition of an ESSA evidence tier, but it can be helpful information when you're trying to think about a particular strategy. The opportunity provided by ESSA is really to rethink the use of evidence and to reinforce that effective evidence-based decision-making should be embedded within a continuous improvement framework. In a guide that we at WestEd produced about ESSA evidence, which is linked here below, and we'll share the link in the chat as well, we present a framework that has 5 main components that work together to guide and support improvement efforts with evidence-based decision-making at the heart. This is based off of the non-regulatory guidance from the U.S. Department of Education. Note that we don't claim that this is the only framework. It's just an organizer to contain all the elements of a solid process to ensure that evidence use is not treated as a one-time event, but rather that it's used throughout the process of decision making. With all this in mind, we want to share some considerations for when you look at research and evidence. In the next few slides, we're going to share a lot of rather dense content, so we encourage you to use your favorite note-taking tool to capture some of the key concepts. After we share this content, we're going to do some scaffolding and practice with you to apply these concepts. The considerations we're going to look at are not an exhaustive list. These are by no means the only things to look for. These are only some of the fundamentals of what you're really going to look for when you dig into research or evidence. You want to look at subjectivity and bias, the research design and outcomes, and the relevance and the context when you think about its fit to your setting. So some questions to ask when considering subjectivity or potential bias is, were the results of the study subject to peer review? Articles published in peer-reviewed journals are usually considered less biased than those published directly by foundations or think tanks, especially partisan ones. Was the study conducted by independent third-party researchers or evaluators? Who funded the study? So even if it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, articles authored by developers or whose authors received funding from program developers may be more biased toward positive findings than those authored by independent or third-party researchers or evaluators. Another consideration is, were the study's outcome measures designed by the intervention's developers, or did the researchers rely on established measures from outside sources? Outcome measures developed by the program developer are often over-aligned or tailored to that specific intervention or program being tested. This may create bias toward positive findings for that program. This can be the case even if a comparison or control was used in the study. More faith should be placed on study findings when established and verified measures from outside sources were used to measure effects. There are also some considerations when you think about the research design. So in addition to the design and the evidence tiers that we just shared with you, there are some additional considerations like, is anecdotal evidence, like a testimonial, the only evidence? Studies that rely on anecdotal evidence will not meet even the lowest ESSA evidence tier, level 4, demonstrates a rationale. Or in some cases it may, but it definitely would not exceed that tier. So anecdotal evidence is not enough to establish the evidence for a particular strategy. Did the study rely on a small sample to draw its conclusions? We're going to talk more about sample size and its importance in a minute, but the non-regulatory guidance from the U.S. Department of Education defines a large sample, and they define that as an analytic sample of 350 or more students. This is based on some Edgar, which is part 7.1, if you want to look at that. That establishes that 350 or more students or other analysis units, like could be teachers or some other unit, or 50 or more groups, such as classrooms or schools, that contain 10 or more students, or another single analysis unit like teachers. As Edgar provides, multiple studies can cumulatively meet the large sample requirement and the multi-site sample requirement, as long as each study meets the other requirements corresponding with a specific level of evidence. So bottom line, look into the size of the sample. A small sample is not going to be enough. Did the study rely on pre-post tests of the same group without a comparison group? A study that uses a pre-post design without a comparison group is considered weaker than a design that uses random assignment or a well-matched comparison group. Studies without a comparison group of individuals that did not receive the treatment doesn't tell us if any of the observed changes in the treatment group would have happened anyway, even without the program. So if there is a comparison group, there are a few considerations. If it did, if the study was well designed and well executed, studies that use comparison groups are usually considered stronger evidence than those that don't use any comparison group. Were the subjects randomly assigned to the comparison group or to the intervention? If well designed and well executed, a study that uses random assignment of conditions is considered to have the strongest evidence, that top level, that top tier, the strongest evidence that a program can be effective. We can be more confident of the study's findings if the researchers establish the types of people or schools or districts in the treatment and comparison groups were not different in meaningful ways. This is considered baseline equivalence. With baseline equivalency, we can also be more confident of the findings if the researchers establish that the subjects that dropped out of the study were not meaningfully different on characteristics that were measured. So was attrition or dropping out from a study above 20%? The more students or other subjects that drop out of a study, the weaker the evidence becomes. Because some dropout is unavoidable, 20% is often used as a cutoff for an acceptable level of attrition from either of the groups in the study. There are a set of considerations when you think about research outcomes. Was there a positive and statistically significant effect on a relevant outcome, one that matches the aims of the program? Were the results positive across all outcomes? Sometimes a study summary or an abstract will report positive program findings for one or a few outcomes. However, closer examination of a research article might reveal that there were no effects on other outcomes or even negative effects. So it's important to dig deeper and dig beyond just some of the initial pieces. What was the effect size or the magnitude of the positive impact? As we note here, a study sample can be so large as to find statistically significant differences that are not very meaningful. As the evidence levels do not include or consider effect size, but it's something, to also provide a little bit more context when you're thinking about the outcomes. So that sample size should be large enough to detect meaningful differences. So we talked about that, kind of 350 being a good marker, without being too large to find statistical significance for a program with small effects. The larger the sample size, the easier it is to reach statistical significance, even if the effect size is small. The smaller the sample size, the more difficult it is to reach statistical significance, even if the effect size is large. In other words, a study that reports statistical significance may also find that the intervention has a small effect. Similarly, a study that does not report statistical significance may also find that the intervention has a large effect. So quantitative research articles almost always report statistical significance. You've probably seen this. It's the likelihood of the study finding a program effect, even when there actually was none. In social science research, a difference that would be found by chance, 5% or less of the time, is usually represented as p less than 0.05, and that's usually considered statistically significant. More and more studies are reporting effect size in addition to statistical significance. I know many of you are familiar with John Hattie's work and others around effect size. Effect size is a measure of the robustness or magnitude of the program's effect. The larger the effect size, the more robust the intervention. Effect size is most helpful to practitioners when it's converted to a real-world metric like days of instruction or increase in standardized test scale score. Final consideration, and I think a really important one, is how well does the study population and setting match your setting? This is really important. So if a study was conducted with a group of students that are really different than yours, you may not be as likely to gain the outcomes that the students in the study did. Or if the study was conducted in an elementary setting and you're looking for an evidence-based strategy for a high school, the setting may not work the same in your setting. So Amy and I are doing a live session on the importance of context when selecting an evidence-based intervention, and it's titled Context Counts, How to Consider Context When Selecting an Evidence-Based Strategy. And we're doing that on June 10th from noon to 1 p.m. We'd love to have you join us to dig a little deeper into this concept.
So what we have here for you is a summary of the key elements to examine summary of the key elements to examine what Lene has just shared with you when looking at a research study. These include the elements we saw on that one pager before, except looking at findings from related studies, except for the one on the previous page that said looking at the findings from related studies. It's important to do when considering an intervention, but these are the elements if you're just looking at one. So as a restatement, on the previous page, the one pager with the improvement cycle, they have the 5 elements at the bottom. This, what you have in front of you here, is the summary of that, except for that multi-study design. So when we're looking at a single study and thinking about whether or not it has the information that we need to make a determination if it meets the correct evidence levels, we have these questions to ask ourselves. Was it subjected to peer review? Was it developed by independent researchers? Does it use any established measures? And what are they? Is the sample size sufficient? As Lene just mentioned, what is that exact number? 350 or more, or where are we at with that? What is the research design? Was it an RCT, a quasi-experimental, or a correlational study? And then what outcomes were measured or studied? Are these outcomes appropriate for that intervention? And are they meaningful and appropriate outcomes? Was the effect size reported? What was that effect size? And remember, effect size isn't required by ESSA, but it can be helpful when you're considering, when used with statistical significance. And finally, and one of the important things as well, is how does this study fit and match to your population? Okay, so now you have an idea of what to look for, as exampled by that previous slide. And so we are going to give it a try. We have a sample study for you here. And what we're going to do is give you some time to read through this study and see what you know about those elements that we just shared. We'd like you first just to take a moment and read through this information. Know that, this is your first go at it, so we're going to provide lots of support and scaffold, but we want you just to first kind of get a glimpse of the study, and then we'll work through those elements. So we're going to pause just for a few minutes and give you some reading time. Okay, about 15 more seconds to finish reading what you can. Don't worry if you didn't get through it all. Okay, so hopefully you were able to at least get the big ideas of this particular study. So we're gonna go ahead and move on and check out and see the next information here. So when you are looking at this study, and know that you're novice ESSA investigators, we know that, but we kind of want to see what you think and see what you've gleaned over this short session together. And again, don't worry, we're going to go over this all together, but we want to get your feet wet and start experiencing some investigating. So we're going to get started with these questions. So in the chat, as we go through, we're going to just do one question at a time, and so we'd like each person to enter in the chat. Based on that research that you just saw, what evidence level do you think this study meets, and why? And you don't have to, you can be as short or long as you want, but we'll just give kind of about 45 seconds to respond. Okay, so thank you for responding to that first question and which evidence level. Be sure you're noticing the chat and have it open. Lene and I will be responding and providing feedback in that space as we see your responses pop up. All right, and then we're going to move on to question 2. As you reviewed that information about that study, what more did you need to know about the study to help you determine which evidence tier it met? Was there anything specific that you needed to help with that? So again, in the chat, I'm going to give you about 45 seconds to think about it and write a response in the chat. And again, Lene and I will be adding notes there. Okay, hopefully you were able to add what additional information you would need to make a determination. The next question is one of my favorite things to look at, and one of the things, admittingly, I am most critical of is, and I have to check my own self, is were there any subjectivity, potential bias considerations, or questions that just made you go, a little bit about the intent or who funded what, and those kinds of things. So those questions that make you wonder, was it completely unbiased research? So did you notice anything about that would make you go, in regard to bias in the study design or the sample study we gave you? Take a second to think about it and type a response in the chat. Okay, our last question to get some responses in the chat. Were there any research design or outcomes questions or considerations that you had? Was there anything that you had a pause about in regard to the research design or the outcomes? So think about that for a moment and add that to the chat as well. Again, Lene and I will be responding via the chat, so be sure to put your information there so that we can have a conversation. All right. Well, thank you for taking a stab at things and giving us your best measure of where you think things land. Hopefully the dialogue and the discussion within the chat has added some clarity for you as this is your first run at determining ESSA evidence. This isn't the only one we're going to do. We're going to actually jump right into the next one. Or no, first, sorry. Let's talk about what we found here. Sorry about that, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, so here's what we notice about this study. So some things that we can be confident about and things that maybe we have additional questions. So when we're thinking about those elements that were shared earlier, peer-reviewed. Well, this particular study was published in a peer-reviewed journal. As Lene mentioned, there's a higher likelihood that there's less bias and more eyes on the research to add feedback. So that's a positive. That there are independent researchers as opposed to like maybe company sponsored researchers. And this is university affiliated research centers. So, you know, that's a great place to be. So I would, depending on the relationship, of course, you always have to dig a little deeper to make sure that there's no you know, connection. You know, if the vendor has supported the whole university library with a grant or an endowment, then perhaps there might be some implied bias, but or unintended bias. But in any case, just to, you know, on the surface level, a university affiliated research center looks great. Again, remember one of my things, question number 3 was I'm super critical about bias and things that I noticed. Next, the established measure is they're using DIBELS and a program embedded assessment. And so DIBELS is something that is valid and helpful and is a tool outside of their own self. If they were just using this program embedded assessment, then there might be something different. But since they have 2, then I think that that's an appropriate established measure. Sample size. So 427 students, and then they had 60 drop out, but we're not sure from which group. So we would want to check for that 20% to make sure that that is not impacted, and maybe see if we can find some additional information about which group. If they all dropped out from one of the particular groups, then, and that caused some numbers to be askew, that might be a pause and a caution to look more deeply into things. But if it's 60 across the whole group, then we're probably okay. But it would be helpful to know those information, or that information. The research design is a random controlled trial that lasted 180 days, which is more than twice as long as the regular program itself. So that's a little flag to make you, these are things that make you go, wondering, you know, how does that work? If the trial is 180 days, but the program itself is only a 90-day program, then that's a disconnect that we would want to dig more deeply in. And if they don't have additional information, then that might be a flag for us to say, oh, we're not too sure about this. So the kinder and first grade students in the treatment group had statistically significantly positive outcomes on both assessments compared to the control group. Second grade, only on the program embedded assessment, and ELs did not make statistical significant gains. Now, if you only have kinder and first grade students, you know, then perhaps this is the right tool for you. If you are a K3 or a K5 program, that might be something to consider. You know, since the second grade group only showed improvement on the program designed tool, that could lead to some questions. And if you have any students higher than that grade, then maybe this isn't quite a great fit. Maybe there's another tool out there. And then I think the important thing, especially with a lot of Arizona schools, is that we have high EL populations. And if ELs did not make statistically significant gains, then is this program the correct fit for your school or district? So, so that would be important to note, and could be a flag as to even if everything else was in order and stellar, if that one component, it doesn't match to your setting, then that could be a cause to not select. Effect size, they didn't report. And then their ESSA evidence tier would likely meet one of the top 3 tiers. I think it's important to note here when we're talking about top 3 tiers in Arizona, specifically in our K3 literacy requirements, we need a tool to reach one of those top 3 tiers. So it's less specific as to which of those top 3 tiers, but it's important that it does reach one of those top 3. And then again here, matching to your setting, which I just mentioned, is especially given the non-significant results for ELs, we would need to consider how this would meet the context of our school and our student needs. So those are some really important things. So even though it's one of the top 3 tiers, if it doesn't meet our student population needs, then it may not be the right fit for us. So there's where we are with that. All right, so we are going to, now that was getting your feet wet, as I said, and so we're going to try another one. So what we'd like to do is have you read another program summary, and we're going to give you a few minutes again just to read on your own, and then we will continue from there. So just some quiet time to read. Okay, a couple more seconds to finish up. Even if you didn't get all the way through, that's okay. We're going to do some work together here. Okay, now that you have the background of that research study, let's take a look at our questions again. All right. What evidence level do you think this study meets and why? Go ahead and respond in the chat, please. Okay, hopefully you can finish up your thoughts and get something submitted in the chat. Again, Lene and I will be responding via the chat to add feedback and information to each of these questions. So question 1 is, it should be taken care of by now. Which evidence level do you think this study meets and why? If we're moving a little fast, that's okay. You can catch up with us or just get them in as you can. Question number 2, what additional information do you need to know about the study to help you determine which evidence tier it meets? So is there anything else that you might need to know to help you make a better determination? Go ahead and take a few minutes to type in your response in the chat. Okay, finish up your thoughts for question number 2 and get them in the chat. And then we'll move on to question number 3. This is our make you go question. Are there any subjectivity, potential bias considerations, or questions that you have related to just the overall information provided? Was there anything that seemed questionable from the standpoint of subjectivity and bias? Take a look and put your thoughts in the chat. All right, we're going to dig into our last question then for this study. Were there any research design or outcomes considerations or questions that you had? Anything related to the design or the outcomes that were questionable or you needed more information? Add those to the chat for us. All right, go ahead and be sure that you've shared your responses to those questions. And now we're going to take a look at the same form, but it's the worksheet, the study worksheet. And this is essentially the same one we just saw for the previous study, but oh no, it's empty. That means that we are going to work on it together. So in the chat, we're going to pop in a link for a Google Doc. And what we will do is just feel free to hop in and start working on the information that you found. Now in the Google Doc, you'll see that we put the research information at the top of the page, and then at the bottom is this blank form to fill out. Additionally, you can use the notes feature if you'd like to add additional comments to contribute to the conversation. So we're going to allow about 5 or 6 minutes for you to look at any of the information that you need to in that research, and then go ahead and add notes. Everybody's welcome to contribute either via the direct information or notes around the edge using the notes feature. So we're going to go ahead and start a timer for, like I said, 5 or 6 minutes. And we will be joining in the conversations as well. So keep an eye out for that. And so hop on over to the Google Doc and we will continue the conversation there. Okay, thank you so much for working in the Google Doc with us. Hopefully you were able to contribute to not only the form, but to the notes in the page and in the chat as we work together to complete this. So Lene, if you want to share with us the information for what we found.
Sure. Well, I think as we make some final considerations, as you really think about how are you going to do this away from our session, what are some of the resources that you have to identify research? Do you have staff who can look at it? How are you going to do these kinds of research reviews? I think you probably saw from the way we talked through this, there's really not one way to do it. There are many different ways, and hopefully some of the tools that we shared with you today will be helpful. But there's different ways that you can review research. And what capacity do you have to conduct these reviews? What kind of time and staff capacity and expertise is there? And I think most importantly for this audience, to what extent and how will you judge the reviews of research and evidence that are done by outside resources or outside sources? We really encourage you to not just take a publisher or vendor's research or marketing material at face value. So Amy, I know you've worked with a lot of LEAs and vendors. What advice would you share with the folks here today?
Well, my best advice is to be a critical consumer. Vendors, their primary job is to sell you something. They want you to buy their program, so they're going to tell you the best parts of their program, whether it's anecdotal or research-based or evidence-based or not. And so investigating the ESSA criteria and requiring that evidence from unbiased research helps whoever's making those decisions in your building or in your district be super thoughtful and consider all aspects in that decision-making process.
That's really helpful advice. Thanks, Amy. We just wanted to take a moment to just encourage you. I know you'll have a chance to complete the survey about the session, so please do complete that. We really do use this information to help us improve our work. So thank you for joining us today.
And we hope that you learned a bit more about ESSA and you are ready to become an ESSA investigator yourself. Well done today, and thanks for joining us.